back, everybody. This is another episode of the Exodus Project. I am your host, Steve Eisenhower, and I'm joined with my good friend, Dan Barwell.
Glad to be here, Steve.
Always good to have you. And today we're going to talk about a topic regarding the church origins, how the machine as we know it now built all the cogs, right? How the gears got put in place. But before we get started, everyone, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and give me and Dan a big thumbs up. So as a preface, I'm going to read an excerpt from an article called "What is a Cult of Personality" by Miss Cynthia Vinnie. This was written a year ago now, October 2021. Definition, she says, a cult of personality, sometimes referred to as a personality cult, is defined as exaggerated devotion to a charismatic, political, religious, or other leader. Authoritarian figures, such as Benito Mussolini of Italy, Vladimir Putin of Russia, are often associated with cults of personality, as are totalitarian regimes, such as the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, Germany under Adolf Hitler, and North Korea under Kim Jong-un. Leaders of cults of personality often use imagery and the manipulation of mass media to form an exalted, even superhuman version of their persona in the minds of their followers. Their followers accept the leader's persona and authority, which leads to their devotion to the leader and their mission to bring about an imagined future.
Right. And I'm telling you, this is what Christianity does and continues to do to this day. That superhuman version of their persona, and right. They try to plant that in the minds of their followers. But cults of personality, when you talk about some of the negative ones, like you mentioned, Adolf Hitler and Stalin, things like that. I mean, people see them as tyrants. But Christianity has always tried to maintain this utopian, divine cult of personality. Mm-hmm. It's huge, and we've talked to death about Christian abuses, right? And,
right.
When it comes down to a charismatic leader, sociologist Mark Weber introduced the concept of a charismatic authority, which most personality cult researchers agree is essential to understanding this kind of leadership. According to Weber, charisma is a certain quality of an individual personality under which he is considered extraordinary and treated as endowed with supernatural or superhuman, or at least especially exceptional powers or qualities. Meanwhile, right. Charismatic authority depends on individual followers. This is so key. It depends on the followers. Mm-hmm. Devotion and trust to an individual leader, right? In this context, followers' perceptions of the leader is crucial to maintaining their legitimacy. And we've discussed this, how this goes on in abusive churches, even right. when sexual misconduct, financial misconduct goes on. This cult of personality mentality helps them mm-hmm. maintain their legitimacy, right. even in the face of that. So they use like media to create and promote a larger than life image of the leader. And Christianity definitively does this with the figure Jesus, right? Another feature of charismatic authority is that it's frequently critical of existing institutions. This is key. It's always critical of existing institutions, and it seeks to bring about some form of change, which could constitute anything from a previous idealized time to revolutionary reform. And the article continues, this mission to disrupt the established order is key to the success of a charismatic leader, as the more followers buy into the belief that there is a crisis in society that current institutions can't fix, the more likely they are to place their hopes in a charismatic leader. The same mm-hmm. basic principles apply to the figure around which a cult of personality forms. And if you trace the history in Christianity to early in the first century, I started to really try to probe this. And I looked closely at the Emperor Domitian. He was the emperor of Rome from the year September 81 until September 96, which was the era that is clearly understood to where the Gospels Matthew Luke and John and the book of Revelations are all written in that period.
Mhm.
And so probing Domitian's life, trying to understand more about what was going on at the end of that first century and where Christianity sat at that time, Domitian kind of deviated from the Roman imperial cult a slight bit to hold power. If you don't know who he was the son of Vespasian, and he was the younger brother of Titus. So that kind of got him into power. But
Mhm.
when I say he deviated from the imperial cult, Steve, he used a couple of practices, and one was this cult of personality, um, propaganda style. He had fostered a cult of personality that gave him control. The people liked him, the armies liked him, but the
Mhm.
Senate hated him, right? And so this is what the way power's seized. If you got the popular consent, he was using, he fostered the cult of personality back in the first century, which kind of set the atmosphere.
Right.
But one thing that he did, Domitian did, if you in early Rome, he nominated himself. Now this eventually got him killed. He nominated himself as something called a perpetual censor. And if you don't know what a censor is in ancient Rome, um, what a censor's role was, this is critical to understanding. And Steve, from me to you, I've been trying to probe this from the angle that Rabbi Tovia Singer has shared, that Rome did not convert to Christianity, but Christianity converted to Rome.
Mhm.
And
For
so
sure.
I've been, with that on my mind, where is the nugget that shows Christianity converting to Rome? And so I was looking in this era of Domitian, and when I looked at, okay, he nominated himself perpetual censor. Now, the role of a censor, okay, in the ancient Roman history, if you look at study what an ancient Roman censor is, it goes all the way back to before the fifth century BC, um, and the censor, believe it or not, held control over the public purse. In other words, if an emperor wanted to go to war, okay, and he wanted to be able to pay his armies off, or if he wanted to build a bridge or a church or something, if he wanted to build anything, he had to get the funds to do it. And the role of the censor was to approve or rubber stamp that expenditure. He
Mhm.
controlled the public purse. But the role of the censor also had to get that money. And so a censor was done. They would tax the Roman people by performing something every 5 years, which was called a lustratio or a lustrum. And when you understand what this is, it's an ancient ritual, but the censor would try to get data. Okay, his job was to understand who owned the land, right? Who owned where was all the riches and wealth of the Roman kingdom, so they could tax it.
Mhm.
Okay, and that's why the censor would do such a thing, which is no reason that, or no wonder that why when the book of Luke was allowed to be in circulation, the censor was also in control of the moral fiber or moral state of the kingdom, or the if we look closely in the early first century, or first century BC, during the tail end of Julius Caesar to Augustus, you've seen the decline of what was the Roman Republic and the
Right.
rise of the Roman Empire.
Yep.
So there was a kind of a transition in that. What worked in ancient Rome, they would try to, forward into conquested nations as well. And in Rome, they had 25 separate territories that each had a leader that made up the College of Pontiffs, going back, to 445, and they weren't elected officials, but they were like nobles,
Mhm.
and they controlled areas within their region, and they would elect a Pontifex Maximus, uh, in the ancient times, which you see that the Christian Church eventually adopted under Roman Catholic or Universalism,
Right.
still under and even when they would perform a censor would perform a census, he would use they would sit in a square, a town square, and they would put out a specific type of chair, and they wore a specific robe, which the Catholic Church still uses to this day.
Mhm.
The same chair and the same robe. But I don't know about you, Steve, but when I was young, I attended a Catholic school in grade school, and they used to make us, we'd get called out every so often, and we'd have to go do our what do you do?
The confessions.
The confessions, in the gymnasium. And so when you look at what this was done in public schools, it is totally reminiscent to the way the ancient censors would work, or their servants or their sub priests would go out and do this.
Right.
And
Right.
part of the stratio purpose, they were it's where they get their infant baptism from. They use specific leaves to sprinkle on children, young girls when they were 8 days old, and boys when they were 9 days old. That all goes back to the ancient Roman lustrum purification ritual. More than that, lustratio ceremonies were also used to purify cities, objects, or buildings, and on some occasions to purify an area where a crime had been committed, or on a notable occasion, like in the city of Athens, by a fellow named Epimenides of Crete, after the Cylonian massacre. Lustratio ceremony was also used to bless crops, farm animals, new colonies, and armies that went into battle. The point is that it was a purification ritual that intended to be a propitiation for sin. Okay, and that's exactly what that ancient Roman lustratio was for, and to grant absolution to those that
Mhm.
had sinned. They were so the office of the censor's position. It had duties divided into three types of duties. First, they had to register the citizens in their own properties in order for the Roman government to tax. They knew where to get it from. Secondly, they had to look after what's called the regimen morum, or uphold the moral conduct of the citizens, and they had to supervise the public funds. So, looking at what this time during Domitian and the formation of the Christian Church in the late first century, what you have is you have their eyes and their targets set on cult of personality and a lustratio style event. Now, this was something that the Romans did every 5 years, and no doubt the Christian doctrine of one propitiation for sin covering it all means they don't have the expenditure of ever having to do it again, right? So it became a very, very attractive idea. But
Once saved, always saved, huh?
oh yeah, to them taking it forward. I mean, looking closely at the history, until they actually gained, like some people say, Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity with this story of him seeing a cross in the sky before going into a battle. But the reality, according to a historian, a 5th century historian, Zosimus, who wrote a book called Historia Nova, according to Zosimus, Constantine had in fact had his son and his wife killed, and he wanted absolution, and he went to the old imperial Roman cult religion leaders, and he wanted absolution. And they just couldn't do it, right, or wouldn't do it. And so he turned to the censor of the time to get absolution. And the censor of that time just so happened to be his half brother, Flavius Dalmatius, who he was his half brother, and he was the son of Constantius Chorus and Flavia Maximiana Theodora. So he was Constantine's half brother. Anyways, just to see how the church had already affected Flavius Dalmatius by that point. When they say Constantine converted to Christianity, his half brother got him absolution.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the historical record, 7 years before the Council of Nicaea, the funds were approved in the year 318
right.
for the building of the first St. Peter's Basilica in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
or in the Vatican Hill there, which was a marshland for a lot of years outside the edge of Rome. And there's a long story there, but the funds were granted by the censor, Flavius Dalmatius, and before the Council of Nicaea, the year before, is when the funds were approved by Constantine and his half-brother to build New Rome, and on the site of the city of Byzantium, which in the year 330 became renamed Constantinople.
Right.
And by that point, you see that target of becoming the censor, having control of the public purse and the moral well-being of the people became. But if you look at the history between that period
Mm-hmm.
and back into the first century.
Another striking point that takes back to the first century is his half-brother, Constantine's half-brother, is a Flavian. And when you dig deep into, early church history and Josephus, the Flavians have their fingers in all that. The Vespasians were Flavians. So
Domitian was the last one, and he ended up getting killed for demanding. Now, here's a point, Steve. When he nominated himself perpetual censor, okay? When Domitian nominated himself perpetual censor, the ancient Roman political system, they always had two censors elected, and nobody could overrule them until one died or was taken out of office and a new one put it in. Then a new one could overrule the previous one. So when Domitian named himself perpetual censor, he was doing something by creating the notion of dogma, or if you will, creed. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Think about what is a creed or a dogma, and then look at the term perpetual censor. In other words, my policy will stand even long after I'm gone, perpetually.
Right.
That's where the notion of during the end of that first century is where the notion of a cult of personality to gain popularity and control of the funds through dogma and creed came into play during the reign of Domitian, and there's no wonder why the Flavian family, consists of the earliest named saints in the church.
You see the personality, Constantine, who really makes the empire Christian. They make up this fabricated story, as you mentioned, about him seeing the cross before battle, but really he goes to his half brother.
He wanted absolution for a sin, yeah.
He goes to his half brother, a Flavian, and these Flavians have all their fingers in,
and all the pies, and
and he gets absolution from him, and then magically he becomes a Christian, right? So it's just showing where at the end of the day there's a common denominator. You know what I mean?
Right, right, but still trying to probe Rabbi Singer's notion that Rome didn't convert to Christianity, but Christianity converted to Rome.
Oh, for
I
sure, for
tried
sure.
my best to look closely and find, you know, uh, the propitiation for sin question was existed long before in Roman Empire under this lustrum. It was done for the expiation of sin in a region, and the ideas were not new when Christianity was pushing that, but you could see why it would be permitted in a Roman environment because the censor, did that same thing,
Hmm.
and a censor would have to do this according to Roman law every 5 years, perform this lustrum because it was set to purify the land for a 5-year term, which is lust term, which is where they get that 5-year term idea from. But the notion of uh, full propitiation, and never have to be done again would stop them from having the expense of having to do this all the time. But if you look closely, you see that it was the perfect setup for the Romans to tax people, and this is why you'll have that story in the book of Luke, a question of the taxation or the census. Rabbi Singer says it never happened, but you look closely. I think the last one, recorded one, was about 74 A.D. In Rome by the one Roman emperor at 74 A.D. It was the last Roman public lustrum, but there was a transitional period from the republic to the empire, and then
Yeah,
how did they
right.
reproduce what they were doing in their own republic on an empirical state? And so yeah, just following the ball, you can see within the rites, if you come from any Catholic background, you can see all the connections.
Hmm.
But then when you look at what the censor did, and you see how its history and what it did, and you can see that the whole Catholic Church was built on the same basic premise,
Right,
uh,
right.
uh, to have a college of pontiffs and electoral their way to govern, and even the during that time of Domitian, you had Clement of Rome, who was considered the Pope at the time, but the term Pope until the year 350, I think it was 350, the word Pope was used for any bishop. And if you
Hmm.
look at the history of it, um, no, the word Pope was used interchangeably with bishop, and there was no electoral, no structure to how
Right,
something
right.
came together. And so this is why they adopted the ancient Roman College of Pontiffs. And I don't want to go on this too long, but what was the actual steam that allowed Christianity to flourish? And
Hmm.
researching it to death, especially between the times of the persecutions that went on and when they were ruled that they couldn't persecute them any longer in the Roman Empire. Just looking at it closely, the steam that gave Christianity the nudge forward. It wasn't their wasn't so much their dogma. It wasn't so much their propitiation of sin question. What was it that, as we read in this cult of personality, how do people gain and keep the real or imagined qualities of a charismatic leader that are established through mass media start to establish a cult of personality, but it's ultimately the response of potential followers that make a cult of personality possible. And we've seen this in everything that we talked about in our abuse series.
Hmm.
Uh, while the overarching mission led by a charismatic leader, such as bringing about a new utopia, is often so lofty that it's unrealistic, follower support is typically built on the inclusion of a more realistic, practical goals, such as better wages or less competition for jobs, that will help followers imagine an improved future. In the cult of personality, the leader solidifies and legitimizes his authority through media manipulation and propaganda that causes followers to believe the leader is the only one who can achieve that stated mission. So how did Christianity do this? Okay. And the reality is, research it to death, it comes down to Christian concept on slavery. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And Rabbi Singer's always said that Christianity created nothing new, borrowed everything, and created nothing new. But I think on this one point, I'd love to hear his opinion. But the reality is, when it comes to their doctrine on slavery, so I got one article up on about Paul in one of his undisputed letters in Philemon, verses 12, 16, and 17. Onesimus had run away from his master Philemon in Colossae, which is modern day Turkey, and
Mm-hmm.
had stolen from him. And the runaway ended up in Rome, where Paul was in prison. Paul led Onesimus to Christ and was sending him back to Philemon with this letter. He says, I'm sending him, who is my very heart, back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me. Onesimus, the word means useful. While I'm in chains for the gospel, he says, you might have him back for good, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. Welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. And the point of the matter is, Christianity had come out with a notion. The more you look at its doctrine and its viewpoint, their concept of everybody being equal brothers and sisters, and people as slaves being free. Yeah. And people who are masters of slaves are in bondage to Christ. They
Mm-hmm.
completely threw on its head the old system that the mass population just loved, and it became the steam that allowed that popularity to grow. Anybody who was poor, and you can pull it out to death in this one article I sent you, Steve. But what should I share? Clearly, the Christian concept of a slave was not a bought thing or a lifeless tool, which was the current state in the Greco-Roman Empire. A slave was a bought thing. It was a lifeless tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
Philemon was to treat Onesimus as he would treat his own brother. A social distinction between master and slave had been vitiated by this new faith. There is a tradition that Onesimus became the bishop of Berea and then was martyred. Christian teachings and texts introduced into the ancient New World new ideas, revolutionary ideas whose time had come. The new faith redefined the historic definition of a slave. He says in 1 Corinthians 7:21 to 20, when you were a slave, called or converted to Christianity, he says, don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who is not a slave when he was called is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. And that's all out of 1 Corinthians 7.
Right, right.
Written around 55, right? But the New Testament writings turned the definition of terms, slavery, on its ear. If you are a physical slave, you are now free. If you are a free person, you are now a slave. All believers in their guy are supposedly free people.
Mm-hmm.
All Christians are slaves. The idea, that was the idea to the ancients, a revolutionary oxymoron. And then Paul continues in Colossians, and if you look at all the writers in the area and the time, they talk about Christian being more, they were more anti-establishment people, is what they
Right,
were,
right.
right? Anything they were considered to be problem, anti-establishment slaves, right? They revolt, and just looking at the whole question surrounded this notion of slavery. And if you look closely, the New Testament was written in Greek, lingua franca, the Hellenized Roman world. The term doulos used in that language as slave was the Greek word used to designate all those in the ancient world who were born slaves or had become slaves. So the Koine Greek word doulos, meaning slave, has been replaced in the Bible translation by the softer word servant, much to the detriment of its original meaning.
Mm.
Right, so the social condition opposite to doulos was eleuthros, meaning free, which Paul used to describe himself as freeborn Roman citizen. Yet in his writing, he calls himself a doulos, still a slave.
Mm.
Yeah, so and he does that in Galatians 1:10. Am I now
Right.
trying to win the approval of men or God, or am I trying to please men? If I was still trying to please men, I would not be a slave or a doulos of Jesus, is what he states in Galatians.
Right. Right.
And then he opens Titus 1:1, Paul, a doulos or a slave of God, and the apostle, da 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 da. But slaves were just things in the old world, right? A bought thing, totally owned by their master and never free to leave. It was scandalous that Paul and other Christian writers identified themselves with wild and worthless members of society. Even Jesus's brothers, James and Jude, said they were slaves in James 1:1 and Jude 1. They call themselves a doulos of, guy. Even Simon or Peter, same in 2 Peter 1:1. He opens that way. Um, in 2 Timothy 2:24, the Lord's slave must not quarrel. Instead, he must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Um, and there's so many other books, but the early Christian church was largely composed of slaves, and of those on the socioeconomic fringes of society, the revolutionary concept was that a believer in Jesus is a slave to him regardless of the believer's social situation.
Right.
Christian is a free person even if he is a slave. The Acts of Martyrdom of St. Justin and companions, written in 105 by an anonymous witness of the trial. The prefect Rusticus asks one of Justin Martyr's companions, "And what are you?" Liptus, a slave of Caesar, answered, "I too am a Christian, having been freed Jesus and the grace of Christ. I partake of the same hope." Right before his beheading, he said these sort of things because this is what the censors were doing. If you look closely,
Right.
this is
Right.
what the censors were doing until the church actually grabbed that office.
Right.
They would conduct these things, these censors, and a lot of the persecutions that happened was like this ancient Catholic rite where they would sit down and have them confess their sins. They became areas of trial. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Philippians 2:5-7, your attitude should be the same as Jesus, who being in the very nature made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a slave,
Mm-hmm.
being made likeness. So the reality, the Christian message that gave them steam was this notion, the idea that God served man. It was explosive era. Gods were served. They're not servants. Instead of a slave being a pejorative word, the Christian God sanctifying and even slave. Um, and he and Jesus himself enjoined his followers in the ancient, it's like the modern world, worshipped royalty and admired those who had power and money. They
Mm-hmm.
aspired to be rulers, but to somebody important, even Jesus' closest friends and family, they wanted to be elevated to possessions of authority, have human adulation. And we see this when the mother of the Zebedee boys, James and John, came to Jesus and asking him to, grant that her sons be on her right hand, on his right hand and left hand. They wanted authority. It just goes to show
Right.
you. But the response that he says, "You don't know what you're asking for. Drink of the cup that I'm going to drink." When we answered, the point is, the more you look in Matthew 20, verse 20 to 28, he says, "Just as the Son of Man did not serve, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." The whole point of the matter is message of altering slavehood, freed person.
Mm-hmm.
It was the steam that allowed the whole idea to take root.
Right, for sure.
Yeah, but I know you've got to cut it short today, but maybe we can do a second part on this and clarify some more of this if
Yeah,
anybody's
for
got
sure.
any
I think
questions.
I was just about to say I think this would be a good spot to wrap up, and then going into the next session we could really dig deeper into each of these
Yeah,
things
cult of
respectively.
personality, what an ancient Roman censor was, and then also Christian concept,
Right, slavery for sure.
slavery and freedom, and what it challenged in that ancient world setting.
Mm-hmm.
You start looking at anything that went on until the church gained that target of the censor role, where they could actually build
Mm-hmm.
the ancient St. Peter's Basilica and New Rome, which became Constantinople. I mean, you just follow the ball. Look at the money and the control, and
Right.
yeah.
Well, all right, my man. Everyone, Dan Barwell, Noachide World Center. Check him out on YouTube. Always a pleasure to have him on here with me. But we'll be back next time with part 2, so everyone keep a lookout for that. But until next time, guys, this was the Exodus Project, and we'll see you on the other side, guys.